while a NATO ally just repatriated 100% of its gold out of America. Here is precisely how. While every financial news channel was screaming about oil, while traders were panicking over markets, while the world was looking the other way, one of America's closest allies quietly moved $15 billion in gold off American soil forever. No press conference, no warning, no headline. And the country that did it sits at the same table as Washington, calls itself America's partner, has done so for over 2 centuries. This was not an accident. This was not routine. This was a message. And once you understand what that message actually says, you will never look at your money, your investments, or this financial system the same way again. Welcome. You have just arrived at the boring currency, where the stories that actually move the world are told without the noise. Now, before we go any further, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, think of it this way. You would not spend 40 years carefully building your savings, your experience, your wisdom about how the world really works, only to miss the briefing that explains why it is all quietly shifting. Would you? Of course not. So do what any sharp, seasoned person does. Hit that subscribe button right now. Take your time. Find your glasses if you need to. We will wait. Now, before we open this completely, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because right now, someone in London is asking the same question, someone in Karachi is connecting the same dots, and someone in Singapore already suspects what we are about to confirm. This is not a comment section. This is a global intelligence room. And you just walked in? The morning of March the 31st, 2026 looked like every other morning in global finance. The headlines were loud, the anchors were nervous, the markets were bleeding. Oil prices were climbing, and the Iran situation was getting worse by the hour. Every major financial network on the planet had its cameras pointed at the same stories, its reporters repeating the same fears, and its experts offering the same tired explanations. The spotlight of global financial attention was burning at full intensity on one side of the room. Traders were watching their screens. Analysts were updating their models. Financial anchors were searching for words that might explain what was happening to the markets. The entire machinery of global financial media was running at full speed, pointed in one direction, focused on one set of stories, completely unaware that the most important financial event of that morning was happening somewhere else entirely. And that is precisely why no one saw what was happening in the shadows. While the world watched the noise, a nation was completing one of the most significant financial operations in modern history. No press release had been issued, no diplomatic cable had leaked, no financial journalist had been tipped off. The operation had been designed from the very beginning to be invisible, and it succeeded completely. By the time the dust settled on that Tuesday morning, 129 metric tons of gold had left American soil permanently. The metal was gone, the custody was gone, and the trust that had kept that gold in American hands for decades was gone with it. The country that executed this operation was France, not a rival, not an adversary, not a nation that Washington considers a threat in any conventional sense. France, a founding member of NATO, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a G7 nation, a country whose relationship with the United States stretches back more than 2 centuries to the very moment America was trying to become a nation. France did not do this by accident. France did not do this in panic. France did this quietly, carefully, and completely. Every single metric ton that had remained in American custody was brought home. The operation was not partial. It was not symbolic. It was total, 100%. And understanding why that number carries the weight that it does requires understanding something that most financial coverage never stops long enough to explain properly. To understand why this story matters so deeply, one must first understand what gold actually means when a sovereign government holds it. For ordinary people, gold is jewelry. For investors, gold is protection against inflation. But for a central bank, for a sovereign government operating at the highest level of global finance, gold exists in an entirely different category from every other asset on the balance sheet. Gold is the only financial asset in the world that belongs to no one else. It carries no counterparty risk. It does not depend on another government's promise to retain its value. It cannot be frozen by a foreign institution acting under political pressure. It cannot be sanctioned by a rival power making a geopolitical calculation. It cannot be printed into worthlessness by a central bank operating on the other side of the world. When a nation holds gold in its own hands, on its own soil, under its own legal jurisdiction, it holds something that requires trust in absolutely no one. That is what separates gold from every other reserve asset that exists in the modern financial system. A government bond requires trust in the issuing nation. A foreign currency reserve requires trust in the central bank that manages it. Even digital reserve assets require trust in the infrastructure that supports them. Gold requires nothing. It simply exists. It simply holds value. It simply sits there, belonging entirely and unconditionally to whoever physically possesses it. That is the property that makes gold irreplaceable at the sovereign level, and that is precisely why where a country stores its gold matters just as much as how much gold it holds. For decades after the Second World War, France trusted America with that asset. A significant portion of French gold sat in the vaults beneath Manhattan, held in custody by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The logic behind that arrangement had made sense at the time. The United States was the dominant economic power. The dollar was the foundation of the global financial system. American soil felt like the safest soil on earth for a nation's most precious financial asset. France believed that. For a very long time, France believed that completely. Generations of French financial policymakers operated inside that assumption without seriously questioning it. The gold sat in New York. The relationship held. The system functioned. And the question of whether that arrangement truly served French sovereign interests in the long run was a question that, for a very long time, no one in Paris felt the urgency to answer. And then, slowly, quietly, without making a single public announcement, without issuing a single statement, without holding a single press conference, France stopped believing it. And what came next changed everything. How a nation moves $15 billion without making a sound. There's a vault beneath the streets of Manhattan that most people will never see, never visit, and never think about. It sits 5 stories underground, resting on the bedrock of New York City. It was built at a depth that places it below the water table of the Hudson River. The walls are thick enough to survive almost anything short of a direct military strike. And inside this vault, for the better part of the last century, sat the gold of nations. At its peak, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York held more gold in custody than any other single location on Earth. Governments from Europe, Asia, and beyond had sent their most valuable financial asset to this address. They trusted that it would remain there, untouched, safe, and available whenever it was needed. For a long time, that trust was never questioned. For a long time, no serious government felt the need to ask what would happen if that trust was ever misplaced. France was about to ask that question. And then France was about to answer it. When the Banque de France made its final decision to bring home the remaining 129 metric tons sitting in those vaults, the first obstacle they encountered had nothing to do with politics. It had nothing to do with diplomacy. It had nothing to do with the relationship between Paris and Washington. The first obstacle was the metal itself, and it was a far more complicated problem than most people would ever imagine. The gold sitting in those New York vaults was not the kind of gold that trades on modern commodity markets today. It was old gold, legacy gold, gold that had been sitting in those vaults since the era of Bretton Woods, when the world's financial architecture was being rebuilt from the ruins of the Second World War. These were coin melt bars, non-standard ingots, pieces of metal cast during a period when precision and standardization were not the priority. They were relics of a different financial era, sitting quietly in the dark, waiting. The purity of this metal ranged between 90 and 91.6%. In today's gold market, that number is a problem. The London Bullion Market Association sets the global benchmark for gold that can be traded, transferred, and recognized across international markets. That benchmark requires a purity of 99.5%. The gold France had sitting in New York did not meet that standard. It fell short by a margin that, applied across 129 metric tons, represented a significant gap between what France technically owned and what France could actually use in the modern financial system. Before a single bar could move, this gap had to be addressed. France addressed it with extraordinary precision. Every bar had to be physically assessed, weighed, tested, and documented against historical records that, in some cases, were decades old. French technical teams operated inside the Federal Reserve facility itself, conducting a comprehensive metallurgical audit that required a level of access negotiated quietly between 2 sovereign institutions. The process demanded patience, expertise, and an absolute commitment to secrecy. Not a single detail of what was being discovered inside those vaults was permitted to reach the outside world. The operation moved in complete silence, exactly as it had been designed to do. What happened next is the part that changes the entire character of this story. Rather than simply transporting the legacy bars back to France in their original below-standard form, French financial authorities made a decision that transformed this withdrawal into something far more sophisticated. They refined the metal. The old coin melt bars and non-standard ingots were processed and upgraded to meet modern good delivery standards. In doing so, France did not merely recover its gold. France recovered its gold in a form worth significantly more than the original bars would have been on the open market today. Conservative estimates place the gain from this purity upgrade across 129 metric tons in the range of several $100 million. Some analysts place the figure considerably higher. France had turned an act of financial withdrawal into a profitable transaction. A nation had walked into a vault, collected what belonged to it, improved it, and walked out richer than when it entered. The financial world, still watching oil prices and market charts, noticed none of it. The metal moved, the money moved, and the message moved with it. The physical transportation of the refined gold was handled with the same discipline that had defined every other stage of this operation. Sovereign gold at this scale does not travel through commercial freight channels. It does not appear on any public shipping manifest. It does not pass through any border crossing that an ordinary observer would ever monitor. It moves through secured sovereign logistics channels involving armored coordination, military escort, and routing decisions that are never disclosed to the public and never will be. The exact path the metal took from New York to Paris will likely never be confirmed. That is not an oversight. That is a deliberate architectural feature of how sovereign nations protect their most critical assets in motion. What arrived at Banque de France storage facilities was unrecognizable from what had left decades ago. It was cleaner, purer, more valuable, and entirely under French sovereign control for the first time in a generation. No American institution held any custody over it. No foreign legal framework governed its existence. It belonged to France, completely, unconditionally, finally. Every significant financial move in history has two stories. The first story is the one that appears in the data, the logistics, the tonnage figures, and the technical operations. That story is interesting. That story is important. But that story is never the real story. The real story is always the one that happened before any of it. The conversation that took place in a private room. The conclusion that was reached quietly, without announcement. The moment when a powerful nation looked at the system it had trusted for decades and decided, with complete clarity, that the trust was no longer justified. And it begins not in 2026, not in a vault beneath Manhattan, not in a boardroom in Paris. It begins in 1965 with a man who understood something about gold, about power, and about the architecture of the global financial system that very few Western leaders of his era were willing to say out loud. His name was Charles de Gaulle. In February of 1965, de Gaulle stood before the world and said something that stunned every financial institution in the Western world. He looked directly at the dollar-based global monetary system and called it what he believed it truly was, an exorbitant privilege, a system carefully constructed to allow the United States to pay its international obligations with paper that only America could print, while every other nation on earth had to earn its position through real goods, real labor, and real sacrifice. He did not stop at words. He acted on his conviction with the kind of decisiveness that separated serious sovereigns from symbolic ones. De Gaulle began converting France's dollar reserves into physical gold and demanding that the metal be physically shipped from New York to Paris. He sent the French Navy to collect it, not a diplomatic note, not a formal request through quiet channels. The French Navy, warships crossing the Atlantic to retrieve what belonged to France. That moment was not merely a financial decision, it was a declaration of sovereign independence dressed in the language of monetary policy. And 60 years later, the nation he led completed what he started. What France did in 2026 was not a new idea. It was the final chapter of a very old one. But philosophy alone does not move 129 metric tons of gold across an ocean. Decisions of that magnitude require specific triggers. They require evidence that accumulates slowly, signal by signal, until the conclusion becomes impossible to avoid. French financial authorities did not wake up one morning and decide to act. They watched, they studied, they waited. And over a period of years, 3 distinct signals arrived that together made the decision not just logical, but urgent. The first signal came from the realm of geopolitics. The relationship between Europe and the United States had been developing a stress fracture that was quiet but unmistakable to anyone paying serious attention. Disagreements over trade policy had introduced friction into a partnership that had once felt unshakable. Tensions over defense spending expectations within NATO had created a degree of uncertainty about the reliability of American commitments that simply had not existed a decade earlier. The foundational assumptions of the transatlantic alliance were shifting, and wise sovereigns have understood throughout history that when foundational assumptions begin to shift, the time to act is before the shift becomes a rupture, not after. France understood this. France had always understood this. The second signal was structural. It was more alarming, and it was impossible to dismiss as political noise. France had watched with careful attention as the United States demonstrated, with increasing frequency and growing confidence, its willingness to use the dollar-based financial system as a direct instrument of geopolitical pressure. The moment that crystallized this signal for French financial strategists was the freezing of Russian central bank assets following the Ukraine conflict. That decision sent a message to every nation on earth that no official in Washington fully intended to send. It demonstrated that assets held within the jurisdiction of the American financial system were not beyond the reach of American political decisions, not enemy assets, not terrorist assets, sovereign central bank assets, the reserves of a national government, frozen, inaccessible, weaponized. France drew a conclusion from that demonstration that no French official would ever state at a press conference, but that every serious French financial strategist understood with absolute clarity in private. If it could happen to Russia under those circumstances, then the logic of the system meant it could, under sufficiently extreme circumstances, happen to anyone, even an ally, even France. The third signal was the one that closed the argument completely and accelerated the timeline beyond any further delay. The COMEX futures market in New York and the Shanghai Gold Exchange had begun diverging in ways that suggested the Western paper gold system was experiencing structural pressure it had not faced in decades. Physical gold was leaving Western vaults at a pace that analysts described as historically unusual. The premium between physical metal and paper contracts was widening in ways that serious observers recognized as a warning. The gap between what the system said gold was worth and what people were actually paying to hold real metal in their hands was growing. French financial authorities looked at these three signals together: the geopolitical fracture, the weaponization of the dollar system, the structural pressure on physical gold markets. They did not need a complex economic model to reach their conclusion. They needed only clear eyes and the courage to act on what those eyes were showing them. The window for a clean, quiet, fully executed repatriation was open. It would not remain open indefinitely. The cost of waiting was rising. The benefit of moving was compounding. And so France moved. Deliberately, silently, completely. There's a particular kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you stop looking at individual events and start looking at the space between them. Single events can always be explained away. A one-time decision, a routine administrative matter, a purely technical adjustment with no deeper meaning. Governments are very skilled at presenting their most consequential decisions in the most ordinary language possible. They have learned over centuries that the less alarming a move appears to the outside world, the more cleanly and completely it can be executed. But when those single events begin appearing in sequence, when the same decision gets made by different nations in different years, under different public explanations, the pattern beneath the surface becomes impossible to honestly ignore. That pattern exists. It has been building for over a decade. And France's completed repatriation in 2026 did not begin that pattern. It confirmed it. The blueprint for everything that followed was written by Germany. In 2012, German lawmakers made what appeared at the time to be a modest and entirely reasonable request. They simply wanted confirmation that their gold actually existed in New York, not a political statement, not a challenge to American institutions, not a straightforward audit request from elected officials who felt they had a responsibility to verify their nation's most critical financial asset. What followed that modest request was anything but modest. The process that began as a simple verification slowly evolved into one of the largest sovereign gold repatriation operations in recorded financial history. Germany recovered 674 tons. The operation took years. It was slow, complicated, and at certain moments diplomatically uncomfortable in ways that neither Berlin nor Washington chose to discuss publicly. When it was finally completed, Germany said very little about why the process had taken as long as it did or what had been discovered along the way. That silence was not accidental, and it was noted by every nation that was watching. Every serious financial strategist in every European capital understood that Germany's silence on the details of that operation carried more information than any official statement ever could have. The Netherlands followed Germany's path in 2014, quietly repatriating 122 tons from New York without significant public explanation. Austria followed, Hungary followed, Poland followed. Each repatriation was presented to the public through the same careful framing: a routine consolidation of national assets, a sensible modernization of reserve management strategy, a purely technical decision made by financial professionals with no political meaning attached. The language was almost identical across different nations, different governments, and different years. That consistency of language, applied to decisions this significant, was itself a signal. Financial historians and sovereign strategy analysts who examined this pattern did not see routine administrative modernization. They saw something entirely different. They saw a quiet, coordinated, and steadily accelerating withdrawal of physical gold from the Western custody infrastructure that had been carefully constructed in the aftermath of the Second World War. They saw nations making decisions in private that they were unwilling to fully explain in public. And they saw those decisions clustering precisely in the same time period during which the dollar-based financial system began showing the stress fractures that France ultimately responded to in 2026. France's position in this pattern deserves specific and careful attention. Because France is not Germany. France is not the Netherlands. France is not Austria, Hungary, or Poland. Each of those nations made a significant decision when they repatriated their gold. But France's decision carries a weight that belongs in a different category entirely. France is the fourth largest economy in Europe. France holds a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. France is a nuclear power. France is one of the founding architects of the Western institutional order that emerged after 1945. When France makes a financial decision of this magnitude, It does not make it as a peripheral player managing its reserves cautiously on the edges of the global system. France makes it as one of the central pillars of that system. And when a central pillar quietly begins to reposition itself, the structural implications for everything connected to it are impossible to calculate away. The message France sent by completing this repatriation was not addressed to Washington alone. It was addressed to every nation still holding gold in foreign custody. It was addressed to every capital that had been watching this pattern develop and asking privately whether the moment to act had arrived. France answered that question loudly, in the only language that sovereign financial strategy truly speaks. The demonstration that France completed is arguably more consequential than the $15 billion it recovered, because France proved something that every remaining holder of foreign custodied gold needed to see proven before they could act with confidence. France proved that the operation is executable, that it can be completed cleanly, quietly, and without triggering a diplomatic crisis or a market catastrophe. France proved that the metallurgical challenges are solvable, that the logistics are manageable, and that the purity arbitrage mechanism can turn the entire operation into a profitable transaction rather than merely a defensive one. France removed every practical objection that might have caused a hesitant nation to delay. The nations that have not yet repatriated their full gold holdings are now operating in a landscape that France permanently altered. They are making their calculations in a world where the blueprint has been updated, the proof of concept has been delivered, and the psychological barrier that once made this kind of move feel drastic has been quietly dismantled. The question those nations now face is no longer whether such a move is possible. France answered that. The question is no longer whether such a move is safe. France answered that too. The only question that remains is the one that no government will answer in public, but every government is answering in private, behind closed doors, in rooms where the most consequential financial decisions of this era are being made in complete silence. How much longer can we afford to wait?